right. So I'm gonna, welcome everybody who's tuning in right now. Looks like there's a, rapidly increasing, almost PhD Excellence in Research Award talk. Usually this talk series, we usually have our 5 winners of this award present at the CSEE conference, which would have been beautiful Edmonton. Of course, I'm sure you're all aware the PhD award give a half-hour kind of public research talk to, or the scientific research talk to the CSE public and anyone else who wants to tune in. So the context for Caribou in Canada, and we're really excited to hear from him. I'm gonna pass things over to Quinn. And throughout the talk, at the end of this 30-minute talk, you'll be able to ask questions. So throughout the talk, type them in either as a comment to the video or as a text in the live stream here on YouTube. And I'll go through these at the end, and you'll be able to, I'll read them to Quinn. So your questions will be transmitted at the end of the talk. But without further ado, I'm gonna.
All right, great. Just gonna share my screen here. All right. Thanks a lot, Peter and CSEE for this opportunity. It's really great. But before I begin, I just want to respectfully acknowledge the territory where the data that I collected during my project, as well as the Memorial University of Newfoundland as the ancestral homelands of the Beothuk, and the island of Newfoundland as the ancestral homelands of the Mi'kmaq and Beothuk people. And so today I'm going to be talking about some of my PhD research, which is based in Newfoundland at Memorial University. And so most of my work was focused on the social behavior of caribou, and I'm titling this talk "Social Behavior in a Spatial Context: From Individuals in Groups to Populations." But of course, before I get to the science, there's a ton of people who I need to acknowledge for this work. Without them, it would not have been possible. And so I just want to acknowledge all of my fantastic colleagues and co-authors, as well as my advisor and the funders who made this work possible. So just a kind of quick shout out to those folks. So my primary interest during my PhD has been investigating the role of the social environment, which I'm defining here as the structure, composition, and size of a social group. And I'm really interested in how the social environment can be a driver of individual behavioral variation, but also how the social and physical environments co-vary to influence animal behavior. So for example, in the top left-hand corner here of this slide, we have an image of some zebras and some other ungulates aggregating at a watering hole on the African savanna. And so watering holes are obviously very important. This sustains life for these animals, but they're a very patchily distributed resource on the landscape. And so in some cases, we might expect that this resource is actually driving social behavior. And so any social connections we observe in these animals could be an emergent property of the physical landscape, as opposed to connections among those individuals. But then on the other side of that coin, we have social systems where individuals are grouped together because they have long-term stable connections with one another that can last years or even decades. And so it's really these kind of differences in social systems that I'm interested in, and how they vary as a function of the physical landscape that they occupy. And so the primary, I guess, narrative of my thesis kind of revolves around this theoretical framework that my advisor and I published a couple of years ago that talks about outlining and integrating how individual social and spatial behavioral ecology kind of should be thought about. And so I'm just going to kind of walk through this image that's on the right-hand side of the slide here. This was a flowchart that we published in the paper. And really, I think that this flowchart kind of is a graphical description of my PhD. And throughout my PhD, I tried to kind of answer different questions that are sort of embedded within this, this diagram. And so if we imagine an animal population, these animals have some social behaviors or phenotypes, but they also have habitat selection behavior or phenotype as well. And often these behaviors are inherently linked to one another, which is why we have overlapping circles. And in many cases, these behaviors can also influence survival and reproductive success, which can be used as proxies for fitness. And interestingly as well, both social behavior and habitat selection can also vary as a function of population density. So these behaviors and phenotypes are density dependent. And so as soon as we start to talk about density dependent behaviors that influence survival and reproduction, we can talk about this feedback loop here. So that's the arrow that's going from the bottom back up to the top. And really what I'm kind of interested in this context is how behavior influences fitness, which in turn should result in more animals on the landscape. So therefore a change in population density, which then in turn should influence the distribution of the behavioral phenotypes that we observe in that group. And so really, I think this is, a tall task to expect of any project, but throughout my PhD, I tried to kind of tackle different bits and pieces of this flowchart. And so I'm going to talk about those today. And I'm going to start off by talking about them from the finest scale and move my way up to the coarsest scale throughout this presentation. So when I think about social behavior and habitat selection or foraging behavior, the thing to me that kind of links these behaviors is movement or collective movement. And really what's interesting here is how animals move collectively when they're foraging, but how that collective movement or group movement is impacted in a less coordinated fashion. Whereas in less favorable environments, they're moving more quickly and in a more coordinated fashion. So that's that blue arrow that you see there, the swoop. And on the right-hand side of the slide, this is an empirical example from a recent paper that studied sticklebacks. And so the authors here found that in the absence of any environmental variation, the fish were moving collectively as a group around in the experiment. But as soon as they added these little foraging areas and kind of like disrupted the environmental heterogeneity, could influence collective movement in the context of foraging behavior in the case of the sticklebacks. And this is kind of the one of the ideas that I was really interested in for my PhD. And so as I kind of thought about this idea and I guess let it kind of manifest a little bit, I really got into thinking about social foraging, which to me is the integration of sociality, movement, and habitat selection. And we should expect social foraging to evolve when an increase in foraging efficiency outweighs the competition associated with the animals that are occupying social groups. So for example, the benefits of social foraging include decreased search time and increased capture rate, which has been empirically demonstrated in gannets. So it's these birds in the bottom photo here, as well. So there's some pretty strong empirical evidence that a lot of different animals engage in social foraging and that it's a very important part of their behavioral ecology. And so as I mentioned earlier, one thing that could disrupt this idea of social foraging is that animals are aggregating on the resource or on the landscape because of a patchily distributed resource, and that this resource actually results in sociality being an emergent property of the landscape as opposed to some sort of kind of social foraging or something else that's happening at the behavioral level. But of course, there's also this social explanation. So whether that's animals that have preference for one another or animals that are taking advantage of information transfer about resources. This idea of social foraging is really appealing to me. And I think caribou are actually a really great system to test some hypotheses about social foraging. In Canada, that landscape is covered in snow for 4 or 5 months of the year. And so what caribou do is they actually dig holes in the snow, and this is called behavior that's called cratering. And so these cratering sites are really important energetically because they have to dig them, so that is an energetic expense. But then they also often will defend them against conspecifics, at least for a short period of time. So it's kind of spots on the landscape where maybe the snow is shallower or it's a windswept area, and so it's easier to dig. And so it's these sorts of, I guess, variables or environmental variables that make the idea of social foraging really appealing in caribou, because they need to take advantage of social information about these spots that are easier to dig, but they also have to balance the costs of competition associated with actually digging the craters themselves. And so to answer these questions, or this question, we used a method called integrated step selection analysis, which is a modeling technique that we can use for GPS collar data sets. And so we used a large data set of caribou collars on Fogo Island in Newfoundland to test this hypothesis. And so the way that this analysis works is that we have collared animals moving across the landscape. So for example, this yellow individual is moving over the landscape, and we can plot it something like this, where at each time point there is a spatial location that we can plot on a map, and we can kind of see the movement trajectory of that animal through space and time. And so we can imagine a kind of hypothetical example might look something like this. And so what we do is we calculate the speed and directionality of how that individual is moving, and we compare it to imagine these black dashed lines as the locations that the animal could have been, but wasn't actually observed. And so in that way, we're able to incorporate kind of where the animal was, and we compare it to where it could have been using these movement parameters. We also incorporate habitat into these models. So at time 3 here, if we expect, or if we observe the animal in this green habitat, we compare that to where it could have been. So it could have been in this yellow habitat, but it was in the green one. And so we're able to incorporate habitat use as well into these models. And the thing that we kind of did here to incorporate the social environment or social foraging is we also calculated the locations of nearest neighbors. So if, say, we have 2 animals moving on the landscape now, the yellow one and the blue one, we at each time point calculated the nearest neighbor to every focal individual and calculated how close animals were. And we did this to determine whether animals were selecting foraging habitat or moving faster or slower in the presence or absence of conspecifics, so whether they were close or far. And so kind of the main take home from this analysis, there's lots of kind of different nuanced results, but the main thing that I think is like really, really interesting here is that we actually found that caribou are selecting foraging habitat alone, but nearest neighbors. So when caribou are occupying lichen habitat, which is their generally preferred food resource, they tend to avoid conspecifics. So they're staying away from each other. However, when they're moving more quickly, we actually found that they tended to select to be close to one another, which is really interesting. And this kind of suggests to us that indeed these cratering sites are really high competition areas. Animals are kind of spacing out as they're foraging. And that makes sense because it's so energetically expensive to, first of all, dig the crater, but then also to defend it. But what's interesting here is we know caribou are really gregarious, and it seems to be that their gregarity is kind of context dependent in this situation, and they tend to socialize more when they're moving. So presumably they're moving between foraging patches after they've kind of depleted an area of the available food. And so the implications of during foraging and suggests that there is indeed competition happening at these cratering sites. So craters can generally be quite small. It clearly relies on information about the next foraging patch. So that's when animals are socializing. It's important for these animals to know where to go next so they can kind of do that spacing out thing again and dig the craters and kind of gain access to that foraging resource that they need. But if we imagine a caribou herd that's in decline, if the animals that possess this information about where to forage next are the ones that are dying, this lack of information in the population could actually really negatively impact overwinter survival or spring reproduction for these animals and kind of further exacerbate the potential decline that's happening in these populations. So the second kind of set of questions that I'm going to talk about today is kind of one scale up from this fine scale movement analysis. So we were interested in how social behavior varies across contexts, and specifically, we were interested in how caribou group size and socialness only to kind of look at caribou social behavior across the year. And so in theory, we would expect that group size should increase as a function of population density. And I think this really just comes down to basic math. As there are more animals on the landscape, we would expect that just by random chance, these animals should be bumping into one another and forming larger groups. And so there are a number of papers going back almost 60 years that have posited this prediction for caribou and other large, the exact opposite response. So as population density increases on the x-axis here, group size actually decreases, which is kind of counterintuitive and a little bit strange. So there's a couple things that could be going on here. One of them is that if annual population size is declining very rapidly, as it was in these herds at the time these data were collected, surviving individuals may actually aggregate in larger groups by reducing kind of group splitting on the landscape. And they might do this because, as I mentioned earlier, it's really important for these groups to stay together so they know where to forage, and they're taking advantage of the other benefits of sociality, subpopulations of the same species. So for example, subpopulation A and B at a given time that we're comparing kind of independent of any continuous measure of density. And in this case, we actually measured group size across a range of population densities through time. And so that could be another thing that's going on here, is that these predictions are actually geared more towards kind of discrete comparisons as opposed to a continuous comparison. And then when we actually compared group size in a population of caribou that had stable density over the time period of data collection, we found that group sizes were much larger in winter than they were in calving in summer. And that is to be expected, as I mentioned earlier, and as I kind of demonstrated with the movement analysis, groups during that time to exchange information about food. Whereas in summertime, there's food all over the place, it's widely available. And so they don't really need to use that kind of social resource, so they don't. And then finally, we also tested this prediction using proximity-based social networks. So these were using, again, the same data set of GPS-collared caribou on Fogo Island. And so the way this analysis works is that we have our animals moving through space and time again. And at each time point, what we do is we generate a buffer around those individuals. And if buffers of 2 or more individuals overlap, we assume that they're in the same group. So as these animals are moving across the landscape, here at time 3, we see that they've have overlapping buffers, and we therefore assume that they're in the same group. And so we did this type of comparison for all pairwise combinations called SPATSOC that my colleague and collaborator Alec developed over the last couple of years. And so I guess just a shameless plug for Alec's package, that if you're ever interested in social networks, especially ones generated using GPS data, I'd definitely recommend checking. Sure enough, we found that social network graph strength increased in winter compared to summer. And again, we assume that this is because animals are taking advantage of social information transfer in the winter compared to summer, when they don't really need to use that technique. So the implications of this work is that the social environment is clearly context dependent. Group sizes appear to be smaller at higher population density, and it appears to be related to the information transfer about foraging areas due to the patchy distribution of these foraging locations in wintertime. So the final kind of narrative or question of my thesis is about how social behavior and spatial behavior are adaptive. And again, I'm just going to return to the flow chart that I talked about off the top. And so far, I think we've kind of talked about how social behavior is context dependent, how group size variance, which is kind of the big idea, and that's kind of the coarsest scale that'll make its way in as well. And so interestingly, and I think importantly, habitat selection or spatial behavior is not very often considered in the context of individual phenotypes. And so in this study, what we did is we quantified a habitat specialization phenotype for individual caribou, and we compared that, and we assessed the relationship between that variable and fitness. And so what's interesting about habitat specialization is that depending on which body of literature you kind of look into, the relationship between this variable and population density is actually very different. So according to the ideal free distribution and the extension of that, which is density dependent habitat selection, at low population density, so when there's few animals on the landscape, those animals should become habitat or resource specialists, which means that they specialize on a single type of food or habitat. And it's these individuals that then have the highest fitness or reproductive success. And then by contrast, at higher population density, individuals should become habitat generalists, and it's these individuals that have higher fitness. And so there's some empirical support for these expectations or these predictions. So McLaughlin and colleagues in 2006 found this fairly strong evidence for this relationship in red deer. And then there's some theoretical work that kind of is among the most underrated papers that talks about ideal free distribution and habitat selection theory. And really, I think that it's these two papers that kind of solidify this set of expectations. But then when we kind of switch over to the niche specialization literature, we actually see the opposite set of expectations. So these expectations are kind of associated with optimal foraging theory as well. And we predict here that at lower population density, individuals should become habitat generalists, but at high density, they should be specialists. And so this is the inverse of what ideal free distribution predicts. And the reason that niche specialization theory predicts this is that as population density is increasing, the abundance of an animal's preferred habitat is reduced because it's being consumed. So the consumption of less preferred habitats or resources becomes more profitable, which explains why animals should specialize. So in this case, animals are specializing on less good food, whereas in the ideal free, less good food at high density, whereas in the ideal free scenario, individuals are specializing on the high quality food at low density. And I guess what's important here as well is that there's no explicit incorporation of fitness in these models. Although there's some kind of discussion of that in a few papers, it's not as explicit as the ideal free distribution theory. But I think it's implied based on the argument that at high density, for example, the less preferred habitats become profitable. And I think that profitability argument implies that, that fitness should be influenced here. And so kind of the first step of this analysis was to, and we expected that social strength or social behavior would increase as a function of density. So something like this. And then again, just as a reminder, as ideal free distribution, or according to the ideal free distribution, we expect that individual habitat generalization should increase as a function of density, but that it should decrease as a function of density according to optimal foraging theory. And so once we kind of take this baseline expectation and we integrate fitness, things start to get a bit wacky here. And so according to ideal free distribution, again, this is just kind of a summary. At low density, we expect that specialists, resource should have higher fitness, whereas at high density, resource generalists should have higher fitness. Whereas for optimal foraging theory, the opposite is true. At low density, generalists should have higher fitness, and at high density, specialists should have higher fitness. And so what we did here is generated proximity-based social networks to estimate social strength. And again, we used that same technique that I described earlier. And we also used a habitat specialization index called the Proportional Similarity Index that was originally proposed by Bolnick and colleagues in the early 2000s. And so this index was originally proposed, I think, with the idea to use gut contents of animals to measure dietary specialization. But in our case, we use the proportion of GPS relocations in a given habitat to use habitat specialization as a proxy instead of actual diet. And then we use calf survival as a fitness for proxy. And we did this using a remotely sensed method that my colleague Megan developed and published a couple of years as co-response variables. And we allowed these variables to have random slopes and intercepts for each individual across the population density gradient that we observed for the herds. And so this is essentially like fitting a behavioral reaction norm for those who are familiar with that. And what this does is it allows individual animals to vary in the model at the individual level across this gradient that we fit it to. And so some results, getting into the results, we found that as population density increased, social strength also increased. So that met our expectation. And just a note here, each of these gray lines represents a single individual, and the length of that line represents the range of population densities that that individual was exposed to during the time of the study. So for all individuals, we saw that as density increased, social strength also increased. Whereas for habitat specialization, we found that as density increased, individuals tended to reduce their or become more specialized in their habitat use. Whereas at lower density, they tended to be more generalized, which supports the set of predictions associated with optimal foraging theory. And so when we compared these variables to one another, which is a logical result because, or which is a logical result, but it's kind of interesting in the context of integrating fitness, because we actually found that we found support again for the optimal foraging theory when we integrated fitness. And again, that's that at high density ones that are kind of getting the greatest fitness payoff. But again, there's a positive relationship between social behavior and habitat generalization. So it's those generalists that are more social. So really what seems to be happening here is it's the less social individuals that are specializing and seem to have higher fitness at high density. And so there's this kind of really interesting context-dependent relationship between these variables. And again, the kind of expectation here, or the explanation here, is that as less preferred habitat becomes profitable at high density, competition should decrease as these individuals specialize. And And interestingly, specialization may actually be a prerequisite for group living. And that's because partitioning of resources and habitats at high density through habitat specialization should reduce competition and actually allow the group to stick together. So again, if we imagine the results from the first chapter, or the movement part of the talk from earlier, these animals are spacing out as they're foraging on the landscape, and this is to reduce competition. So we found evidence for this out of lists, but the fitness payoff is highest for specialists. And again, just to reiterate, it's really hard for animal density is high, and it's these individuals that are getting the highest fitness payoffs. And I think interestingly, from an evolutionary ecology perspective, changes in population density are clearly promoting adaptive behavioral variation, at least in habitat specialization, but I think by proxy also for social behavior. And so just to sum up, I think that kind of my biggest takeaway here is that social behavior, habitat selection, and movement are inextricably linked. And in this diagram that I showed at the beginning and that we published a couple of years ago, we only have social behavior and habitat selection as our kind of individual phenotypes. And I would actually argue that I think it's really important that when we're thinking about these things that we have to think about movement as well. And we found evidence for that in our project where we see that caribou are foraging alone, but moving together. We also see that social behavior is clearly context dependent across a variety of different contexts, including population density, of how caribou social environments are density dependent and how this could aid caribou conservation. So for example, if individuals are relying on the ability to specialize in a social context, the downstream consequences could impact individuals that are negatively affecting their survival and reproduction, which could further compound the issue of declining populations. And so for caribou, reduced population density would almost be more impacted in winter because this is the period when resources are the most limited. And in general, we found that social behavior tends to be stronger in winter. So I think that it's, maybe it's a bit of a stretch, but I do think it's really important that we do start to kind of talk about the relationship between social behavior and population dynamics in caribou as we move forward. So with that, again, I'd just like to thank my advisor, Eric Vanderwall, as well as all of my co-authors and lab mates on these different projects. I definitely could not have done it without them. And I'd also like to thank the current and former members of the Newfoundland and Labrador Wildlife Division who collected some of this data as well as curated it. And of course, all of the funders that gave us money to do this. So
that was a terrific talk, really exciting subject, fascinating results. And yeah, there are a few questions that have poured in. So
cool.
But yeah, so first question, I'll just get right to it, is this individual is wondering, they said, interesting how much larger the groups are after winter. I'm not sure the resolution of your data, but I'm curious if the groups reform the following summer as they were in the previous summer.
Okay, interesting. Yeah. So for our project on Fogo Island, we find pretty strong group fidelity. So the same individuals tend to have fairly high site fidelity. And it seems like when we, even just anecdotally, when we go out there, we're like, oh yeah, there's the same 10 individuals that are always in the same group kind of thing. So at that level, yeah, we're definitely seeing kind of individual fidelity to certain social groups. And I think there's some aspect of space to that as well. These animals have fairly high site fidelity, especially to their calving areas on Fogo, as well as in some of the Newfoundland herds as well. So yeah, I think as the groups kind of split and merge throughout the season, they're definitely coming back together throughout the year, for sure.
Okay, yeah. This next question kind of dovetails off of that. Wondering how much social partner identity matters, i.e. how stable is group membership? Is it better for caribou to maintain a stable association with a particular individual?
Yeah, so that's also a really cool question. And we, I guess, here I can go back to included in these analyses is actually social preference or social familiarity index. So not only how close were you to your nearest neighbor, but who was it and how familiar are you? And so in general, we found that, yeah, so these animals are foraging alone and they're moving together, but when they are close to each other during foraging, it's with their kind of preferred familiar individuals. So they definitely have kind of a social preference for one another, for sure. So yeah, that was kind of something that got cut just in the interest of time.
Yeah. Wow, awesome. Another question for the first half. Do you know if habitat or forage quality affects selection or avoid?
Unfortunately, the resolution of the habitat data is not the greatest. It's just kind of what is the habitat type, and then there's a kind of series of habitats, lichen and different forest types and some different kind of other like wetland and stuff like that. And so unfortunately, we don't know kind of at the within habitat level what is going on, whether it's high or low quality lichen, for example. But yeah, our kind of next plan, or our plan for the future in terms of figuring that out, is to do some vegetation surveys and kind of get an idea of the, I guess, within habitat variation in quality of lichen. That's kind of on the horizon, I think.
Yeah. Does I'll step in as kind of the moderator here. I'm wondering, I'm curious how much kind of microclimates play a role in a lot of this habitat selection.
Yeah, so definitely in the wintertime, caribou tend to occupy the lee side of hills. So the snow is shallower because the wind will blow it off. And they often also tend to be kind of on the tops of hills, I guess. So that where the wind is blowing it away, sometimes it might just be barren rock and the lichen itself. So they might not even have to dig into the snow. And then obviously on the other side of the hill, there's like, potentially a 15-foot snowbank. So they definitely have kind of micro habitat selection in terms of.
Okay, we'll see if we can get through one more, maybe two more questions here. This one is about sociality and specializing.
Yeah, that's a really good question. And I think that kind of pits this ideal free and optimal foraging theory ideas against each other, are just generalizing, because they can kind of, there's no monopolizing of any resources going on. And animals are kind of all just eating everything. And so there's no limited, I guess, competition happening. And I suppose the, I guess, flip side of it being generalists. So that's another kind of alternative scenario that we didn't really test. But yeah, I think at least in terms of fitness, in terms of the kind of fitness payoff, it does seem like the optimal foraging theory set of expectations is what's happening. So at high density, individuals are specializing, and they're probably specializing on less, I guess, preferred, in our case, habitat types. So they're all.
Mm-hmm. Awesome. Thank you for that answer. And then more of a modeling question. This questioner says, very interesting results. In your big multivariate mixed model.
Question, I think it's within individual. Yeah, I think it's within individual.
Mm-hmm.
And I think the reason you do within individual, and if that person is still listening and they're curious, you can send me an email and we can chat about it. But I think the reason you do within individual is so on these behavioral reaction norm plots that you can generate from those models, you will, as like the trend line, if we were to have run 45 separate models, one for each individual, just in a linear regression framework. So I think that it's within individual. I think that's the way.
Awesome. Yeah, great memory for remembering. I'm sure this was a while ago that you did this, so good on you. And so there's one more question in this chat here.
Okay.
So awesome talk. For the habitat specialization section, is habitat selection likely to be a plastic trait? And if so, would you expect switching between generalized versus specialized habitats?
Yeah, that's really interesting. And I think that in the, I guess, thesis chapter / eventually paper there, we do talk a little bit about plasticity and how, individuals, I guess this figure here, panel B, suggests that individuals are plastic to variation in population density, and they're able to kind of moderate their specialization behavior and kind of change what they're doing. And I think that at, a kind of big picture scale, if individuals are able, they do show plasticity.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Quinn. You can pop out of your screen share if you'd like. Terrific talk. That was excellent job. Thanks for bearing with us for the technical difficulties at the beginning. Thank you. Was really received, Quinn, and congrats again on the award.
Great. Yeah, thanks a lot for that.
Awesome. For everyone watching, tune in next week. Next week will be Anne McLeod, another one of our winners of the CSEE PhD award. So tune in same time next week for another great PhD award talk. Bye, everyone.
Thanks again.